Hello again, 102. In this video from chapter 22, we will go over modernism and how modernism and that movement influenced American culture in the 20th century. And modernists were rebellious intellectuals, writers, and artists who engaged in a relentless search for new and scandalous modes of expression and behavior. The world broke in two in 1922 or thereabouts, so said the celebrated American writer Willa Cather. They saw the start of the 20th century as a historical hinge, opening the way for a new worldview or Weltanschauung that rejected traditional values like progress, reason, or even God, and notions of reality. And in writing, James Joyce published his path-breaking novel Ulysses, which was done in stream of consciousness. He doesn't like to use periods. He just keeps rambling on and on and on. And Jack Kerouac in the 1950s will also use that stream of consciousness technique in his writing. And the Anglo-American poet T.S. Eliot wrote The Wasteland. Path-breaking works of literature in the early 20th century. Modernism, as much a state of mind as a movement, did not simply drop out of the sky in 1922. It had been years in the making. During the early 20th century, people were both inspired and terrified by an explosion of new scientific and technical knowledge that unveiled the troubling mysteries of the universe. Since the 18th century Enlightenment, conventional wisdom held that the universe was governed by basic laws of time and energy, light and motion. This rational world of order and certainty disintegrated in the early 20th century, thanks to the discoveries of European physicists, such as Einstein and relativity. In the first decade of the 20th century, Albert Einstein, a young German physicist, published several research papers that changed science forever. Yet it was Einstein's third paper that truly upended traditional notions of the universe. It grew out of one of his favorite thought experiments. And there's a nice picture of Einstein, who was awarded the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1921. If you were in a train that neared the speed of light, would you see time and space differently? Einstein's reflections led to his special theory of relativity in 1905, which explains that no matter how fast one is moving toward or away from a source of light, the speed of that light beam will appear the same, a constant 186,000 miles per second. But as the train accelerates to near the speed of light, time on the train will slow down from the perspective of the stationary observer, and the train itself will get shorter and heavier. Wow. The picture of an artist, drawing the picture of an artist, drawing the picture of an artist, and so on. As you get farther away from it, it's just a little speck of dust. Heavy-duty stuff. And nothing is fixed or absolute in Einstein's bewildering universe. Everything is relative to the location and motion of the observer and the effects of gravity, which warps time and space. Things are definitely bending when you get out into space. Things are not geometric, but they are elliptical. They bend after time. And that fit right into modernism, defined here as radical new forms of artistic expression. And Einstein revolutionized time, space, and light. And that made television possible, transistors, that makes all the modern electronics today in the 21st century possible. He was a revolutionary physicist. There are no absolute standards or fixed points of reference in the world. And during the 20s, this idea then of relativity, gradually emerged in popular discussions of decidedly non-scientific topics such as sexuality, the arts, and politics. And we've already talked about that revolution in manners and morals that was influenced by this idea of relativity. There was less faith in absolutes, not only of time and space, but also of truth and morality. And just as Darwinism became not just a biological theory, but also a social, economic, and political force, so too did Einstein's concept of relativity shape many of the intellectual, cultural, and social currents of the 20th century. Moral relativism, ladies and gentlemen, can be thought of as one of the themes of the 20th century, along with social engineering, attempting to solve problems by political means, or even worse, and also the will to power. Three big themes of the 20th century. That comes from Paul Johnson in his book on America in the 20th century. To be modern in the early 20th century was to break free of tradition by taking chances, violating artistic rules and moral restrictions, and behaving in deliberately shocking ways, as we've seen, including treating sexuality with startling frankness. Art, said a modernist painter, is meant to disturb. And that's also the influence of photography as well, because photography has come in now, and there's no reason for an artist to try to paint something as it actually is, because you can just take a picture of it and do the same thing. Modernism manifested three unsettling assumptions. 1. God did not exist. 2. Reality was not rational, orderly, or obvious. And 3. In the aftermath of the Great War, social progress could no longer be taken for granted. And this was a huge art show on the East Coast in 1913, where a lot of avant-garde artists were on display, like Van Gogh, Gauguin, Matisse, Cézanne, Picasso, and they were criticized because they're in love with science, but not with objective reality. At times, a New York Times critic complained, adding that they had produced paintings revolting in their inhumanity. And former President Theodore Roosevelt dismissed the show as repellent from every standpoint, an indication of the gap separating political progressivism from artistic modernism. So not everybody's on board with modernism, ladies and gentlemen. The lost generation of Fitzgerald influenced literature. They were influenced by the Great War and its horrors. Cynicism had replaced idealism, a 20th century idea. Cynicism. As Fitzgerald asserted, there is only one lesson to be learned from life anyway. That there's no lesson to be learned from life. Oh, man. And in another famous novel of the 20s, The Sun Also Rises, Ernest Hemingway's main character is injured in the war and he becomes impotent. And because of his impotence, it leads him to wander the cafes and nightclubs of post-war Europe with his unhappy friends, who acknowledge that they are all wounded and sterile in their own way. They have lost their innocence, their illusions. This is T.S. Eliot also has this sort of themes in his poetry. Their motivation now to do anything with their lives has been lost. And its meaning. What does life mean after all the discoveries of modern science and the results of the horrors of the Great War? Life is very disturbing. It's not progressing. And that's some of the trends of modernism beginning in the early 20th century and on into the rest of the 20th century.